Guys, Master Studios here. How y'all doing? Welcome to my new and improved recording area. As you can see, there are some big changes that have been made to my recording area. Got a brand new table to put sets on, and I got some stands in order to display a bunch of my sets. I really hope you guys like it, and this is going to be the way that things are going to look now whenever I record videos. And again, I hope that you guys enjoy it. But with that out of the way, let's get into the video. So when it comes to Ninjago, we've seen the ninja go up against a bunch of different villains over the years. So many villains. But have you ever wondered which villains are specifically villains of a certain ninja? Given how many villains there are over the years, some of them are specifically meant to be villains for a certain ninja. But again, have you ever wondered which villains would be considered a villain for one certain ninja? Well, in today's video, that's something that I want to take a look at. I'm going to take a look at a bunch of major villains that we've gotten over the years when it comes to the franchise, and discuss which of them I think fit with being a certain villain for a specific ninja. So, let's get into this whole thing. Now, when it comes to actually determining which villain is a specific villain for a ninja, there's a lot of different things to take into consideration. Stuff like which villains have major dynamics with certain ninja, how many times do a villain and a ninja interact with one another, as well as the season itself where a villain is introduced, or the seasons that a villain is in, which can determine if they count as a villain for a certain ninja. Additionally, not every villain will be specifically a villain for one singular ninja, because there are some villains where you could consider them to be villains for multiple ninjas. Additionally, there are some instances where a villain would be a villain for a character that isn't a ninja. And you'll see what I mean when we actually get to the video, but there are some villains that don't necessarily line up as being villains for specific ninjas. And so with all that out of the way, let's get into this whole thing. So starting off at the very beginning, we have Samukai. And Samukai is an interesting case because he's one of the instances where we have a villain who isn't really a villain of any of the ninja in particular. When it comes to Samukai, although we do see him fighting against Kai during the first episode of the pilot season, and he does go after Jay during Day of the Departed, I wouldn't really say that Samukai is a villain of any of the ninja in particular, and if anything, Samukai is more of a Garmadon antagonist. Given their rivalry that we see during the events of the pilot season, as well as seeing just how much these two hate each other during the events of the pilot season, Samukai, I'd say, counts more so as a Garmadon antagonist rather than him being an antagonist of any of the ninja. Although, speaking of Garmadon, he's the next villain to take a look at, and obviously he's a Lloyd antagonist, considering just how much these two interact with each other over the events of the show, and some pretty big dynamics that we end up seeing with these two once again all throughout the show, and these two both being integral to each other's stories, especially during the events of the Oni trilogy. So when it comes to Garmadon, he is definitely a Lloyd antagonist when you look at things. After this, we have Pythor, and once again, he's a Lloyd antagonist, given once again how much these two interact with one another, especially in the earlier seasons when Lloyd and Pythor's stories were more connected, especially during Season 1, given how Pythor was unleashed by Lloyd, and Pythor ended up capturing Lloyd during Season 1, and in later seasons, like Day of the Departed and Crystallize, we still get instances showing us that Pythor is obviously a Lloyd antagonist. Moving on from this, we then have Kozu. And Kozu's another instance where he's not really a villain for any of the ninja in particular, primarily because Kozu, just like Samukai, doesn't really have a major dynamic with any of the ninja in particular, and when it comes to Kozu, he's really more of a Dareth antagonist, primarily because of Day of the Departed, with Kozu directly going after Dareth, with him wanting to get revenge on Dareth for taking control of the Stone Warriors during Season 2, so when it comes to Kozu, he's a Dareth antagonist. After this, we have the Overlord, who's really more so an antagonist for the ninja as a whole, given how the Overlord is meant to be the main overall antagonist for the entire Ninjago franchise, so it makes sense that he would be a main villain for the ninja in general, although it's pretty obvious that when it comes to the Overlord, he's more so meant to be a Lloyd antagonist. Given that Lloyd is essentially the main overall character of Ninjago, it makes sense that his antagonist would be the main overall antagonist of the show. Plus, not to mention, we've seen Lloyd go up against the Overlord more times than any of the other ninja, so when it comes to the Overlord, he's a Lloyd antagonist. After this, we have General Cryptor, who's obviously meant to be a Zane antagonist, given the rivalry that we see between these two during the events of Season 3 and during Day of the Departed, and Cryptor making numerous comments about Zane, obviously in a negative sense, and he does see Zane as a rival and also a brother, so Cryptor is obviously meant to be a Zane antagonist. So moving on from this, we have Chen, and when it comes to Chen, I'd honestly say he would be the first instance of us getting a villain who isn't specifically a villain for one character in particular. Because when it comes to Chen, I feel like it's safe to say you could consider him to be a Garmadon and Lloyd antagonist. For Garmadon, it's pretty obvious why, given that when it comes to Garmadon, he was initially Chen's student, and Chen further pushed him down the path of evil, which ultimately led Garmadon to hate and resent Chen, as can be seen throughout Season 4, and Garmadon does play a direct role in trying to stop Chen during the events of Season 4, and the same thing goes for Lloyd as well, as he also plays a pretty direct role in trying to stop Chen, even being the one to ultimately defeat him in the end by sacrificing Garmadon and sending him to the Cursed Realm. Now, when it comes to Chen, he does go after Kai and Nia during the events of Day of the Departed, but that's really the only time we ever see Chen have a major dynamic with Nia. Kai, he does have a slightly larger dynamic with him during the events of Season 4, but I wouldn't really say that Chen is specifically a Kai antagonist, and I would say that when it comes to Chen, he is more so an antagonist of Garmadon and Lloyd. Moving on from this, we have Klaus, who once again is a Garmadon antagonist, given how these two do have a big rivalry, as can be seen throughout the events of Season 4. So when it comes to Klaus, he is a Garmadon antagonist. Moving on, we have Moro, and when it comes to Moro, he would be an antagonist for Lloyd and Kai. When it comes to Lloyd, it's pretty obvious why. Moro really wanted to become the Green Ninja to the point where he felt entitled to becoming the Green Ninja after everything that he went through during his training under Sensei Wu, and Moro specifically possessed Lloyd, and he hates Lloyd for him becoming the Green Ninja. And when it comes to Moro, he also represents why Lloyd did become the Green Ninja, with Lloyd being a good person, being really selfless, especially with him choosing to become the Green Ninja, instead of Moro, who selfishly wanted to become the Green Ninja. So Moro being a Lloyd antagonist makes sense. And when it comes to Kai, Moro would also be an antagonist for him specifically, considering the dynamic that these two have earlier on during the season, with Kai doing what he can to try and stop Moro throughout the events of Season 5, particularly with Kai trying to get Moro to stop possessing Lloyd in order to get Lloyd back to normal. But also, Moro represents what could have happened to Kai if he became the Green Ninja, with the two of them sharing a lot of similarities between the two of them. Primarily with the two of them being really hot-headed, the two of them getting really jealous quickly, the two of them both being arrogant, and so on. And when it comes to Moro, he's very similar to Kai if you took a lot of his character flaws and essentially cranked them up to 11. So when it comes to Moro, again, he represents what could have happened to Kai if he became the Green Ninja. So when it comes to Moro, in addition to being a Lloyd antagonist, he would also be a Kai antagonist. After this, we have Nanakon, and he's pretty obviously a J antagonist, given the major dynamic that these two share throughout the events of Season 6, and these two doing whatever they can to try and fight back against one another all throughout the season, with the two of them also sharing some similarities with one another. When it comes to these two, it makes sense that Nanakon would be a J antagonist, but I feel like you could also consider Nanakon to be a Nia antagonist, considering that Nia also has a major dynamic with Nanakon during the events of Season 6, and when it comes to Nia, she really hates Nanakon, once again, as can be seen throughout the events of Season 6. So when it comes to Nanakon, I would say that you could consider him to be both a J and Nia antagonist. After this, we have Sensei Yang, who's very obviously a Cole antagonist, given the fact that when it comes to Yang, he was directly responsible for Cole becoming a ghost, and Cole went to go and fight against Yang during Day of the Departed for turning him into a ghost. And Cole does whatever he can to stop Yang from opening up the rift during Day of the Departed, so when it comes to Yang, he is a Cole antagonist. So moving on from this, we then have a Crocs and Crux, and these two are interesting because when it comes to the two of them, they are meant to be antagonists for Kai and Nia, given how they are the main villains during Season 7, but they're also pretty obviously meant to be antagonists for Sensei Wu, given how Sensei Wu really wanted to stop Acronix early on during Season 7, and Sensei Wu does have a direct role in stopping Acronix and Crux at the end of Season 7. So when it comes to the Time Twins, it makes sense that they would both be antagonists for Wu. The question, though, is when it comes to Akronix and Crux, are the two of them both villains for Kai and Nia, or would only one of them be a specific villain for one of them? And I do think that would be the case, with Akronix specifically being a Nia antagonist, while Crux is specifically a Kai antagonist. And the reason why I say that is because when it comes to Kai and Crux, these two do have a larger dynamic during the events of Season 7, especially with Kai learning that his parents were traitors from Crux. He's the one who directly tells him during the events of the season. Plus, the two of them are both meant to be the older sibling, while Akronix and Nia are both the younger sibling. So when it comes to the Time Twins, I would consider the two of them to both be Sensei Wu antagonists, but Akronix specifically would be a Nia antagonist, while Crux would specifically be a Kai antagonist. After this, we then have Harumi, who is clearly a Lloyd antagonist, given the fact that the show makes it really clear that Harumi hates Lloyd and she wants him to suffer, and Harumi does a lot of really bad stuff to Lloyd throughout the events of Seasons 8, 9, and Crystallize. And a big thing that we see Lloyd going through during the Wild Rain era is him learning how to get over Harumi and move on from her. It makes sense that when it comes to Harumi, she is a Lloyd antagonist. After this, we have Iron Baron, who's in an interesting position, primarily because he doesn't really have any major dynamics with any of the ninja, because he doesn't really directly interact with any one of them in particular throughout the events of Season 9. And when you take a look at things, Iron Baron is really more so an antagonist for Sensei Wu, particularly because of what we see with these two towards the end of the season. And when it comes to Iron Baron, he's essentially meant to be like an evil version of Wu, primarily with the two of them both using their words in order to get people to do certain things, although for Sensei Wu, he uses his words to inspire the ninja and help them, while Iron Baron uses his words to manipulate his hunters. So when it comes to Iron Baron, he is a Wu antagonist. And then we have the Omega, who, just like Iron Baron, doesn't really have any specific dynamics with any of the ninja, and the only one who he directly interacts with is Lloyd, but even then, that's only during episode 3 of Season 10, and when it comes to the Omega, he is more so meant to be a Garmadon antagonist, given that when it comes to the Omega, he's meant to represent everything that Garmadon doesn't want to become, meaning a completely evil villain who's only focusing on survival and nothing else, something that Garmadon does eventually overcome at the end of Season 10, so when it comes to the Omega, he is a Garmadon antagonist. Moving on from this, we then have Asphira, who's pretty obviously meant to be an antagonist for Sensei Wu and Kai. When it comes to Sensei Wu, Asphira does everything that she does during the events of the Fire Chapter and Crystallize in order to get revenge on Wu for seemingly betraying her 1,000 years ago, even though that isn't what happened, and Asphira's entire goal is to make Wu suffer like she did, but worse. Meanwhile, when it comes to Kai, Asphira stole his powers towards the beginning of the Fire Chapter, and she used them all throughout Season 11. Asphira also ended up using the Sword of Fire during the events of Crystallize, and during the Quest for the Lost Powers book, Kai thinks that by fighting against Firefang, the giant snake that Asphira used during Season 11, he would be able to get his powers back, so when it comes to Asphira, she's pretty obviously meant to be a Kai antagonist. After this, we have the Ice Emperor, and when it comes to the Ice Emperor, he is definitely meant to be a Zane antagonist, given that the entire idea for the Ice Emperor is that he's meant to be an evil version of Zane who's had his humanity completely taken away from him, and Zane ultimately becoming his worst nightmare of him becoming a machine that just follows orders with no humanity or soul at all. And when it comes to the book Quest for the Lost Powers, by facing himself as the Ice Emperor and forgiving the Ice Emperor, Zane is ultimately able to unlock his elemental powers again. So the Ice Emperor is obviously meant to be a Zane antagonist, but at the same time, the Ice Emperor I feel would also count as a Lloyd antagonist, given that a big part of Lloyd's story during the Ice Chapter revolved around him putting his trust into the Ice Emperor in order to try and get Zane to remember who he is, which is what ultimately happens at the end of the Ice Chapter. And speaking of the Ice Chapter, after this we then have Vex, who, just like the Ice Emperor, is an antagonist for Lloyd and Zane. When it comes to Zane, Vex is the one directly responsible for turning Zane into the Ice Emperor in the first place by erasing his memory, corrupting him with a scroll of forbidden Spinjitzu, and lying and manipulating him. And when it comes to Zane, he is the one who's ultimately able to defeat Vex at the very end of the season. Meanwhile, when it comes to Lloyd, the entire idea behind Vex is that he is meant to be an evil reflection of Lloyd, showing what could happen to Lloyd if he gives in to his trust issues and his negative outlook on the world, something that ultimately does not happen as a result of Lloyd being able to put his trust into other people and see the good in the world again. So when it comes to Vex, he is an antagonist for Lloyd and Zane. Moving on from this, we have Unagami, who's clearly obviously meant to be a J antagonist, given that when it comes to Unagami, he really only has a dynamic with Jay, as can be seen during Season 12 and Quest for the Lost Powers. Plus, when it comes to Unagami, the entire idea behind him is that he's meant to be an evil version of Jay who was never able to come to terms with him being abandoned by his parents. While Jay was able to come to terms with this, Unagami never was, and he was fixating on his parents abandoning him, and he could never let that go, something that Jay, again, was ultimately able to do. So when it comes to Unagami, he is a J antagonist. After this, we have the Skull Sorcerer, who's obviously meant to be a cool antagonist, given that the entire idea behind the Skull Sorcerer is that he is meant to be the exact person who Cole has been standing up to his entire life after making that promise to his mom all those years ago. And when it comes to Vangelis, again, he represents the exact kind of person who's cruel and unjust and a tyrant who Cole has been trying to fight against this entire time. So when it comes to King Vangelis, obviously he's meant to be a cool antagonist. So moving on from this, we then have Chief Mamatus and Ronin. And when it comes to these two, they're in an interesting position because I honestly wouldn't really consider either of them to be an antagonist of any of the ninja, primarily because neither of these characters really have any major dynamics with any of the ninja during the events of the island. We see these two interacting with the ninja during the island, but again, it's never with any one ninja in particular. So I wouldn't really consider either of them to be a specific antagonist for any of the ninja in particular. Moving on from this, we then have Calamar, who's clearly meant to be a Nia antagonist during the events of Seabound, given the amount of times these two interact with each other during the events of Seabound, Nia doing whatever she can to try and stop Calamar during the events of the season, Nia being the one directly responsible for stopping Calamar at the end of the season, and these two sharing a surprisingly large amount of similarities between each other during the season, and the two of them essentially being parallels of one another. So when it comes to Calamar, he's obviously meant to be a Nia antagonist. After this, we have the Mechanic, and I honestly feel like you could consider him to be an antagonist for two ninja in particular, Nia and Zane. When it comes to Nia, the reason why I call him a Nia antagonist is because of what we see with these two during the events of Season 11 and Crystallized. When it comes to Season 11, the Mechanic says that Nia is the worst out of the ninja, and his story during the episode The Absolute Worst is him talking about a time when Nia was able to defeat him, and during the events of Crystallized, we see these two fighting against each other a few times during the events of that season, with Nia being able to overpower the Mechanic towards the end of the season. Also, a big idea when it comes to both Nia and the Mechanic is the idea that you can do great things even if you don't have powers, and when it comes to Nia, she's meant to be a good guy in that regard, and for the Mechanic, he's meant to be a bad guy in that regard. But again, they both represent the idea of how you don't need powers in order to do great things. Meanwhile, when it comes to Zane, I'd also consider the Mechanic to be a Zane antagonist, primarily because of what we see with these two during the events of Prime Empire and Crystallize, with the Mechanic doing stuff like calling Zane the Pain, him being able to defeat Zane towards the end of Season 12, and the Mechanic using Zane as essentially a human or robot battery in order to power the manifestation gate at the end of Season 12, so I would consider the Mechanic to be a Zane antagonist. And then we have Mr. F, who I would also consider to be a Zane antagonist, primarily because the idea behind Mr. F is that he was meant to be the rival character for Zane during Crystallized, and we do see these two fight against each other at the end of the season, so I would consider Mr. F to be a Zane antagonist. So moving on from this, we're now getting into Dragon's Rising, and this is where things get interesting, primarily because when it comes to Dragon's Rising, we've gotten a lot of villains so far, but not all of them really have dynamics with the ninja, as villains like Rapton and Drama don't really have any specific dynamics with any of the ninja, and we also have some other villains like the Forbidden Five, who at this point also don't really have any specific dynamics with any of the ninja. There are definitely some villains that do have larger dynamics with the ninja, but not all of them do. And it does look like for some villains we are going to be getting those dynamics later on, like during Season 3, for example. So things are definitely going to get interesting when it comes to Dragon's Rising. Although before I do get into the Dragon's Rising villains, there is one thing that I want to say first. I'm not going to be counting Jay as a villain here, primarily because there is still a lot of things that are incomplete when it comes to Jay at this point, when it comes to Dragon's Rising, and we don't really know how things are going to go for him during Dragon's Rising, so I'm not really going to be counting him as a villain for any of the ninja in particular, although if you do want to count him as a villain for any of the ninja, then Nia would make the most amount of sense given the fight that these two have during Season 2. But again, when it comes to this video, I'm not going to be counting Jay as an antagonist at this point given what we've seen in Dragon's Rising. So when it comes to Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, like I said, there are some villains like Raptin and Drama who don't really have any specific dynamics with any of the ninja, so I wouldn't really consider either of them to be villains for any of the ninja in particular. And also, the same thing I feel could also apply to Beatrix, because despite her being the main antagonist of Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, we never really see her directly interacting with any of the ninja during the season. If you did want to call her a villain for any of the ninja in particular, Sora would make the most amount of sense given that Sora is from Imperium and she is the one who's able to inspire the people of Imperium to fight back against Beatrix. Even though the two of them don't directly interact during Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, Beatrix being a Sora antagonist would make the most amount of sense. And speaking of Sora antagonists, we also have Jordana, who would also obviously count as a Sora antagonist, given the rivalry that we see with these two during Seasons 1 and 2 of Dragon's Rising. And then finally, there's Roz, who's meant to be an Eren antagonist, given that when it comes to Roz, he and Eren do have a pretty big dynamic with each other, especially during Season 2 of Dragon's Rising, with Roz doing what he can to try and manipulate Eren all throughout the season. And I feel like you could also say that Roz is a Lloyd antagonist, given some of the interactions that we see between these two during Season 2 of Dragon's Rising. And I feel like when it comes to Season 3, they're going to potentially build on some of that stuff. So when it comes to Roz, it would make a lot of sense for him to be an antagonist for both Eren and Lloyd. And so that then brings us into Season 2 of Dragon's Rising, which at the time of me making this video is the most currently released season for Ninjago. And when it comes to the villains to go over, we've already gone over some of them, such as Roz and Jordana. And like I said, at this point, when it comes to the Forbidden Five, we haven't really seen them have any major dynamics with any of the ninja. So the only real new villains to take a look at would be Cinder and Zeatrix. And when it comes to Cinder, he's clearly meant to be an antagonist for Kai and Wildfire, given the rivalry that he ends up having with these two during the events of Season 2. And when it comes to Zeatrix, she's meant to be a Lloyd antagonist, given what we see with these two during Part 2 of Season 2. And Lloyd being able to defeat Zeatrix in their round against each other during the tournament is meant to be a big turning point for Lloyd's character arc during the events of Season 2. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the villains of Dragon's Rising at this point. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. When you take a look at all the villains that we've gotten over the years, I think it's honestly really interesting seeing which villains you could consider to be certain villains for a certain ninja. And when you actually tally up the results, I feel like there's some surprising things that you'll see when you take a look at the different villains. When it comes to Lloyd, he unsurprisingly has the most amount of villains, having 10 villains in total. After that, surprisingly, it's Zane, who has 5 villains when you take a look at it. After that, there's then Kai, Nia, Sensibu, and Garmadon, with all of them being tied, with them all having 4 villains. After that, there's then Jay, Cole, and Sora, with all of them having only 2 villains. And finally, there is Eren, Wildfire, and Dareth, with each of them only having 1 villain. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me what are your guys' thoughts on this list, and tell me which villains would you consider to be the villains for a certain ninja. Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys. This is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.